The silent morning. Trevor awoke with a start, his small body jolting upright in bed. The sudden quiet of the house seemed unnaturally loud, filling the air like a thick fog. It was early, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon, but something felt wrong. The house, usually buzzing with the sound of his mother's morning routine, was eerily still. Trevor's heart began to race as a deep sense of unease settled in his chest. Usually by this time, he would hear the clinking of dishes in the kitchen, the smell of eggs and bacon wafting through the air. But today, there was nothing. Pushing off his covers, Trevor sat up and rubbed his eyes. The silence pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He glanced around his room, his eyes landing on the familiar pictures of his family that adorned the walls. They were a comforting reminder of better times, of a time when everything felt whole and safe. His mother had always made sure he knew how much she loved him, always so present and full of life. But today that life seemed absent. Trevor stood from the bed, his bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. He was only 10 years old, but today he felt older, as if the weight of something heavy was already pressing on him. His heart thudded in his chest, and he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his stomach. "Mom," he called out softly, the word escaping his lips like a whisper. He waited for a response, but none came. His breath hitched, and the knot of worry in his stomach tightened. Something was wrong, and Trevor could feel it deep in his bones. He moved cautiously toward the door, his small hand resting on the doorknob. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. As he walked down the hallway, his footsteps seemed to echo, each one louder than the last. The silence of the house was overwhelming. It wasn't normal. When he reached the door to his mother's room, Trevor's heart skipped a beat. The door was slightly ajar, a crack of darkness visible through the gap. His instincts told him to stay away, but his feet moved forward before he could stop them. He gently pushed the door open, his fingers trembling as he did so. "Mom," Trevor called again, his voice small and shaky. This time, his voice quivered with a new fear, one he couldn't quite name but felt deep in his chest. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. The soft light filtering in from the window painted everything in a muted, ghostly glow. And then he saw her. His mother, Jasmine, was lying motionless on the floor beside her bed. Her dark hair was spread out around her head like a fan, the strands catching the light in a way that made her seem almost unreal. Trevor's breath caught in his throat. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. His mother, the woman who had always been the center of his world, wasn't moving. "Mom." Trevor's voice trembled as he rushed to her side. His hand shook as he gently placed them on her shoulder, nudging her. "Mom, wake up. Please wake up," he cried, his words desperate. But there was no response. Trevor's hands were trembling uncontrollably as he shook her more forcefully, his mind spiraling into panic. His mom was always there, always up early, always moving, always in control. But now she was as still as stone, her skin cool to the touch. No matter how much he pleaded, she didn't open her eyes. His cries grew louder, but they were met with silence. A surge of panic washed over Trevor, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know what to do. His small hands fumbled for his mother's phone on the nightstand, his fingers barely able to grip it. In his panic, he dialed the first number he could think of. 911, "What's your emergency?" The calm voice on the other end of the line was like a lifeline in the sea of panic that had overtaken Trevor's mind. "I can't wake my mom up. She's on the floor, and she won't move." Trevor sobbed, his words coming out in a rush, barely intelligible. "Okay, sweetheart, you're doing great. Stay calm. Can you tell me your address?" The dispatcher said gently, their voice a steady presence amidst the chaos swirling around Trevor's mind. Trevor's mind raced. His heart pounded in his ears as he rattled off their home address, his voice cracking with fear. The dispatcher praised him for being brave, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside him. Good job, Trevor. Now, is your mom breathing? Can you see her chest moving? The dispatcher asked. Trevor held the phone to his ear with one hand and leaned close to his mother, his small fingers trembling as he touched her wrist. He could barely see her chest moving. I don't know, he whispered into the phone, his voice barely audible. I can't tell. Please, you have to help her. The dispatcher's voice remained steady, but Trevor could hear the faintest edge of urgency in their tone. Help is on the way. Stay with me, okay? I'm going to stay on the line with you until help arrives. Can you unlock the front door for the paramedics? Trevor nodded, even though he knew the dispatcher couldn't see him. He took a deep breath and wiped his tears away, trying to steady his hands enough to unlock the door. He had learned that the lock was tricky, but today it seemed to resist him more than ever. I'll do it, he said, his voice trembling. I'll unlock it. As the dispatcher reassured him that help was coming, Trevor felt his heart slow just a fraction. The sirens, distant at first, were growing louder, cutting through the stillness of the morning like a knife. They were coming, but it still felt like an eternity. Every second dragged on for what felt like hours. I'm still here, Trevor, the dispatcher said. Keep holding your mom's hand. Don't leave her side. We're almost there. Trevor did as the dispatcher instructed, holding tightly to his mother's hand. Tears streamed down his face as he willed her to wake up, to speak to him, to show some sign of life. But there was nothing. His mother was a shadow, and he was all alone. Finally, the sirens grew louder, their wail reaching a deafening crescendo. Trevor's heart jumped in his chest, and he let go of his mother's hand, rushing to the front door. With trembling fingers, he unlocked it and stepped aside, waiting for the help he so desperately needed. The sound of hurried footsteps approached, and within moments, 2 paramedics burst through the door. Where's your mom, buddy? One of the paramedics asked gently, his voice kind but urgent. This way, Trevor whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. He led them to his mother's room, watching as they immediately set to work, their movements quick and efficient. They checked her vital signs, speaking in medical terms Trevor didn't understand, but their seriousness was clear. Officer Riley arrived moments later, his face tight with concern as he knelt down beside Trevor. He placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder, his expression one of quiet understanding. Hey there, buddy. I'm Officer Riley. Can you tell me your name? He asked, his voice calm and reassuring. Trevor mumbled his name, his gaze still fixed on his mother's lifeless form as the paramedics worked to stabilize her. Officer Riley's eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene. His gaze fell on a cluttered desk in the corner, and with a look of curiosity, he moved toward it. A stack of unopened bills caught his attention. The bold red letters on some of them were unmistakable. Fine ale, no tie C. A sinking feeling settled in Officer Riley's stomach as he rifled through the papers, his eyes narrowing as he took in the gravity of the situation. Something wasn't right, but the truth was far from clear. What had happened to this once strong woman, this mother who had done everything she could to provide for her son? What dark secrets were lurking beneath the surface of this quiet, modest home? As Officer Riley carefully examined the room, he knew that the answers he was seeking were just beginning to unfold, but they were answers that would leave him and everyone involved shocked, and the truth was darker than anyone could have anticipated. Unraveling the past. The sound of the paramedics' swift movements filled the room, but to Trevor, it felt as though everything was happening in slow motion. He stood to the side, his small body trembling, watching as the professionals worked to stabilize his mother. His mother, Jasmine, had always been his rock, strong, confident, and full of life. But now, as the paramedics efficiently performed their tasks, all Trevor could see was the stillness that had overtaken her, the pale color draining from her face, her body limp and unresponsive. Trevor's eyes followed every movement, trying desperately to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. He longed to reach out to her again, to somehow breathe life back into her. But he knew that was beyond his power. His small, fragile fingers twitched at his sides, yearning to do something, anything, to help. But what could he do? He was just a child. The paramedics worked in silence for a few moments, their faces serious and focused. One of them, a woman with dark brown hair pulled tightly back into a ponytail, glanced up at Trevor, her eyes softening for a moment. "Hey, buddy," she said in a gentle tone. "We're going to do everything we can for your mom, okay? Just stay close." Trevor nodded, his lips trembling. He couldn't speak. He wanted to, but the lump in his throat was too large to allow any words to escape. His mind raced, and his heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't expected this, not this sudden. Just the day before, his mother had been fine. She had tucked him into bed, kissed him goodnight, and promised they would go to the park the next morning. But now, everything was shattered. What had happened? Why wasn't she waking up? The sound of the front door opening pulled Trevor from his thoughts. He turned to see Officer Riley entering the room, his uniform pristine, and his face set with an expression of deep concern. Riley was a steady presence. He always had been. But now, even the officer seemed unsettled. His eyes flickered to the paramedics before landing on Trevor, his gaze soft but filled with unspoken questions. "Hey there, buddy," Officer Riley said gently, his voice low and comforting. "I'm Officer Riley. Can you tell me your name?" Trevor nodded quietly, his gaze never leaving his mother's still form. "Trevor," he whispered, the sound barely audible. Officer Riley knelt down in front of him, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. He placed a hand on Trevor's shoulder, trying to offer some comfort, though he could tell it wasn't enough. "You're doing great, Trevor. I know this is hard, but we need to help your mom. Can you tell me if there's anyone else here with you?" Trevor shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "No, it's just me and Mom." Officer Riley gave him a small nod, his expression darkening as he rose to his feet. He glanced around the room, taking in the details. The room was modest, the bed unmade, clothes scattered around, and the scent of the house was a strange mix of something unclean and something too familiar. But it wasn't the state of the room that caught his attention. It was something else. His eyes fell upon a small wooden desk in the corner, covered in a mess of unopened bills. Piles of them, some with bold red letters across the top, warning of overdue payments. Officer Riley's stomach tightened as he approached the desk. The sight was unsettling, but not entirely unexpected. He had seen this kind of thing before, people trying to manage their lives, working hard, but drowning under the weight of debt. Riley's eyes skimmed the papers, picking up one of the bills that had a final notice stamped across it. He let out a quiet sigh, feeling the weight of the situation deepen. As he set the bill down, his eyes were drawn to a small stack of photographs. The pictures were old, their edges frayed and yellowed with time, but they were still beautiful, capturing moments frozen in time. Riley picked up the first photograph. A younger Jasmine, dressed in a crisp suit, standing proudly in a courtroom. Her eyes were sharp, her expression confident, and her posture straight and sure. She looked completely different from the woman lying on the floor just a few feet away. Riley turned the photo over and saw a caption written in fading ink. "Jasmine Wilso, rising star in legal world." His brow furrowed. He turned the picture back around and studied her face. He flipped through more photos, each one showing Jasmine in various legal settings, posing with colleagues, accepting awards, and working on high-profile cases. The contrast between these images and the woman lying lifelessly on the floor was jarring. It was as though the Jasmine in these photos wasn't even the same person. "Is everything all right, officer?" a paramedic asked, noticing Riley's silence. Riley looked up at the paramedic and nodded, his voice tight with disbelief. "She was a lawyer. A damn good one, too," he muttered, his words filled with a quiet awe. The paramedics paused in their work, exchanging glances. One of them, a man with a graying beard, picked up one of the photos, his eyes narrowing as he studied the woman in the picture. "I've seen her around," he said, his voice quiet. "Isn't she the one who helped clear that guy's name a few years ago?" Officer Riley nodded. "That's her, all right. Jasmine Wilso. She used to be one of the top attorneys in the city." He exhaled sharply. "But look at her now." The room fell into a heavy silence, each person processing the weight of the discovery. The woman who had once stood in front of juries, fighting for justice and equality, was now a shadow of her former self. It was as though all the light in her life had been extinguished, leaving only the remnants of something that had once been full of promise. "Trevor," Riley said softly, kneeling down to the boy again. "Your mom has done some really important work. She's helped a lot of people." Trevor looked up at him, his eyes wide, but his face blank, as though he didn't fully understand. He had never known his mother in that light. To him, Jasmine was simply his mother, the woman who made him breakfast every morning, who walked him to school, who tucked him into bed at night. The idea of her as someone with a powerful career, someone who fought in courtrooms, was hard to grasp. "What happened to her?" Trevor whispered, his voice small and filled with fear. He looked up at Officer Riley, his eyes searching for answers. "Why is she like this?" Officer Riley hesitated, his heart heavy with the weight of the question. He wanted to give Trevor the comfort of certainty, but he knew there were too many unanswered questions. He glanced at the paramedics, who were preparing to transport Jasmine to the hospital, their faces focused, but with an undercurrent of uncertainty. "We don't know yet, Trevor," Riley said gently, "but we're going to do everything we can to help her. She's strong, and she's been through a lot. We'll make sure she gets the care she needs." Trevor nodded slowly, though the worry never left his face. He clutched the officer's hand tightly, as if holding on to something stable in the midst of a storm. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, none of which had clear answers. How had his mother fallen so far? What had happened to the woman in the photos, the one who once stood in a courtroom, winning cases for the wrongfully accused? Where had she gone? As the paramedics wheeled Jasmine out of the room, Trevor felt a hollow emptiness spread through him. He wanted to follow her, but Officer Riley gently held him back. "You need to stay here for a little while, buddy," he said softly. "We'll go to the hospital as soon as we can." Trevor nodded numbly, his heart heavy with the weight of all that had happened. The image of his mother's pale face haunted him, and the mystery of her life before now lingered in the corners of his mind, unanswered. What secrets was she hiding? What had caused the fall from grace that had led her to this point? And most importantly, would she ever wake up to answer the questions he so desperately needed answered? As the sound of the ambulance doors closing echoed through the house, Trevor stood frozen in the doorway, the room growing colder around him, feeling more alone than he ever had before, unraveling the past. As the paramedics carried Jasmine out of the room, her body suspended on the stretcher, Trevor watched with hollow eyes. The house, once filled with the energy of his mother's presence, now felt like a cavern, silent and empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the ambulance's engine outside, growing fainter as it sped away. Officer Riley stood next to Trevor, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. But even Riley, with all his experience in handling difficult situations, couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in his chest. There was something about this case that didn't add up. A woman of Jasmine's caliber, so successful, so determined, reduced to this. It didn't make sense. "Come on, buddy," Riley said softly, nudging Trevor forward. "Let's head to the hospital. We'll get there as soon as we can." Trevor nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the door, the spot where his mother had just been taken. He could feel the ache in his chest growing, a constant gnawing worry that would not be silenced. Was she going to be okay? Would he ever get to hear her voice again? His thoughts tumbled over each other, a whirlwind of fear and confusion. As they made their way out of the house, Trevor's mind kept returning to the pictures he had seen in the room. The photos of his mother as a lawyer, a powerful woman who had once stood tall in the courtroom, fighting for justice. But now she was just gone. At least, that's what it felt like. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Officer Riley tried to make small talk, but Trevor couldn't focus on anything except the terrifying thought of losing his mom. The car ride seemed to stretch on forever, the distance between them and the hospital feeling like an eternity. When they finally arrived, Riley led Trevor inside, his small hand clutching the officer's much larger one. The sterile smell of the hospital hit Trevor immediately, the bright white walls and harsh fluorescent lights making everything feel cold and impersonal. It was the kind of place you never wanted to be, the kind of place where bad things happened. Riley led Trevor to a waiting area, and the boy slumped into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, his eyes never leaving the door where the doctors had taken his mother. Riley pulled up a chair next to Trevor, his posture tense as he waited for any news. The seconds ticked by, and then minutes, then hours. Trevor could feel every moment stretching out, each one more agonizing than the last. His stomach churned, and his head pounded. He wanted to be with his mom. He wanted to hold her hand and tell her that everything would be okay. But he couldn't. He could only wait, helplessly. As time dragged on, Trevor's mind wandered back to the pictures in his mother's room, to the photos of her in the courtroom, confident and assured. How had things gotten so bad? Jasmine Wilso, once the pride of the legal world, had given up her career to raise her son. Trevor knew that. But what had happened after that? What had led them to this moment, to a mother fighting for her life, while her son sat in a hospital waiting room, filled with fear and uncertainty? Riley seemed to be lost in his thoughts as well. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when something didn't quite add up, and this situation had all the markings of a puzzle yet to be solved. He had seen it before, people who had once been on top, only to see their lives crumble in a way that no one could have predicted. But Jasmine's case felt different. It felt more personal somehow. "Hey, Trevor," Riley said, breaking the boy's reverie. "Do you want to talk about your mom? I know this is really hard, but maybe we can figure some things out together." Trevor turned his head slowly, his eyes red from the tears that had yet to stop falling. He shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand. Why isn't she? Why isn't she getting better?" Riley's heart clenched at the boy's pain. He had seen children face unimaginable situations, but nothing compared to the look in Trevor's eyes now. Pure, raw confusion, the kind that only a child could feel when faced with something so monumental. "I don't know yet, buddy," Riley replied softly. "But I promise we're going to find out what happened. We'll get to the bottom of it, okay?" Trevor nodded again, though his heart didn't believe Riley's words. What could they possibly do? How could they fix something so broken? Just then, the door to the waiting area opened, and a doctor in a white coat walked in. His face was grim, his expression serious. Trevor's heart sank, a feeling of dread filling the pit of his stomach. "Are you here for Jasmine Wilso?" the doctor asked, his voice steady, but with an edge of sadness that made Trevor's skin crawl. Riley stood up quickly, his hand still resting on Trevor's shoulder. "Yes. How is she? Is she going to be okay?" The doctor hesitated for a moment, his eyes briefly flicking to Trevor before returning to Riley. "I'm afraid it's not looking good. She's in critical condition. We're doing everything we can, but we're not sure how she's going to respond. It's serious, officer." Trevor's head spun, his world tilting on its axis. His mother, his strong, brave mother, was dying. The thought was too much for his young mind to comprehend. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all that came out was a soft, broken sob. "Can I see her?" Trevor whispered, his voice barely a sound. The doctor's face softened. "Not right now, buddy. We need to keep her in intensive care. We'll update you as soon as we know more." Riley stepped forward, placing his hand gently on Trevor's back. "It's going to be okay, Trevor. We just need to wait and see." But Trevor didn't believe him. How could he? His mother wasn't okay, and Trevor didn't know how to fix it. As the doctor left the room, Riley sat back down next to Trevor. He knew the weight of what was happening here, the desperation in the boy's eyes, the fear that was choking him. But there was little anyone could do, except wait. And as they sat in the sterile waiting area, time seemed to drag on, each minute a reminder of just how fragile life was. And yet, somewhere deep within Trevor, a spark of hope still flickered. His mom had always told him she was a fighter. She had fought for others, for what was right, for justice. Maybe she could fight this too. Maybe, just maybe, she would pull through. But as the hours stretched on, and no new information came, the hope began to feel more like a fragile thread, about to snap under the weight of reality. Is she going to make it? Trevor asked quietly, his eyes cast down at his hands. Is she really going to be okay? Riley's heart sank as he looked at the boy, struggling to find the right words. We're doing everything we can, Trevor, Riley said softly. We just need to stay hopeful. And remember, you're not alone in this. We're all here for you. Trevor nodded, but inside, the doubt gnawed at him. The truth, however much he tried to avoid it, was starting to settle in his heart. His mother was fighting for her life, and he didn't know what would happen next. Hidden letters and unspoken secrets. The minutes stretched into hours as Trevor sat in the stiff plastic chair of the hospital waiting room. His small hands gripped the fabric of his jeans, twisting and untwisting nervously. Officer Riley remained by his side, a quiet and steady presence, though Trevor could sense the wheels turning in the officer's mind. Trevor's thoughts were a jumbled mess, oscillating between memories of his mom smiling and cooking breakfast to the haunting image of her lying still on the bedroom floor. The sterile hospital air, thick with the scent of antiseptic, only amplified the surreal nature of the day. He felt as though he had been thrust into a nightmare with no way out. Meanwhile, back at the house, Officer Riley had dispatched another officer, Detective Sarah Colton, to look further into the scene. Riley trusted Sarah's keen eye for details and her ability to pick up on things others might overlook. Something about Jasmine's situation didn't sit right with him, and he needed answers. Detective Colton's discovery. Detective Colton arrived at the small, modest home as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the distant sound of children playing and the occasional bark of a dog. She stepped into the house, her senses immediately tuned to the environment. The living room was tidy but sparse, a sign of someone trying to keep things in order despite clear financial struggles. Colton's sharp eyes quickly spotted the same stack of unopened bills Riley had mentioned. Her fingers skimmed through them, noting the final notices and foreclosure warnings. The weight of debt was heavy here, she thought, but that wasn't the full story. Moving further into the house, Colton's attention was drawn to a small, dusty box tucked beneath the cluttered desk. Something about its positioning seemed intentional, as though someone had tried to hide it. She pulled it out and carefully opened the lid. Inside, she found a collection of letters, each one addressed to Jasmine. Colton frowned as she read through the letters. Most were handwritten, the words scrawled in an urgent, almost frantic tone. They spoke of a legal case gone wrong, of threats, and of danger. One particular letter caught her eye. It was signed only with the initials Tito and warned Jasmine to stay silent about a case she had worked on years ago. Her pulse quickened. What case? And why was someone threatening her over it? Colton dug deeper into the box, uncovering old court documents and newspaper clippings. They painted a picture of Jasmine's career as a brilliant and fearless attorney. One article highlighted her role in overturning the conviction of a man who had been wrongfully accused of embezzlement. Another detailed her fight against a powerful corporation accused of environmental violations. But then, the trail went cold. The article stopped abruptly, and there was no record of her career after a certain point. It was as if Jasmine had vanished from the professional world entirely. Colton's instincts screamed that there was more to this story. Why had Jasmine left such a promising career? What had happened to push her into financial ruin and isolation? And most importantly, was it connected to her current condition? Trevor's world unravels. Back at the hospital, Trevor sat hunched over in the waiting room, staring blankly at the floor. Officer Riley was on the phone, speaking in hushed tones to Detective Colton about her findings. Trevor didn't pay much attention. His mind was elsewhere. He thought about the time his mom had come home late one night, her face pale and drawn. She had hugged him tighter than usual, whispering, "Everything's okay, Trevor. I promise." But it hadn't been okay. Not really. He remembered hearing her crying in her room when she thought he was asleep. He remembered the strange phone calls she used to get, the ones she would answer in a hurried whisper before locking herself in her bedroom to talk. A wave of anger and fear washed over Trevor. He didn't understand why his mom had to suffer so much. She had always tried so hard to take care of him, to shield him from the hardships of their life. But now, sitting in the hospital, he felt the weight of those hardships pressing down on him. "Trevor." Riley's voice broke through his thoughts. Trevor looked up, his face pale and tired. "Yeah. We're going to head back to your house for a bit," Riley said gently. "There are some things we need to check out, and I think it'll be good for you to be in a familiar place." Trevor hesitated, his stomach churning at the thought of returning to the house where his mom had collapsed. But he nodded anyway. He didn't have the energy to argue. The return to the house. The house felt colder than Trevor remembered. The light filtering through the windows seemed dimmer, and the silence was oppressive. He walked slowly through the front door, his eyes darting around as though expecting something to jump out at him. Detective Colton was still there, her expression serious as she examined a stack of documents on the dining table. When she saw Trevor, her face softened slightly, and she gave him a small nod. "Hi, Trevor," she said. "I'm Detective Colton. I'm just here to help figure out what's going on with your mom." Trevor nodded, his eyes drifting toward the living room. He noticed the box on the table, its contents spread out in a neat but overwhelming display of papers, photos, and letters. "What's all that?" Trevor asked, his voice small. Colton exchanged a glance with Riley before crouching down to Trevor's level. "These are some things your mom kept in her desk," she explained. "They tell us a little bit about her past, about the work she used to do as a lawyer." Trevor's brow furrowed. "My mom was a lawyer." Colton nodded. "She was a very good one. She helped a lot of people, but it looks like something happened that made her leave that work behind." Trevor's mind raced. He had always known his mom was smart, smarter than anyone he knew, but he had never imagined her as a lawyer. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a version of her he couldn't quite picture. "Did something bad happen to her?" Trevor asked, his voice trembling. Colton hesitated, her gaze flickering to Riley for support. Riley stepped in, placing a reassuring hand on Trevor's shoulder. "We don't know for sure yet, buddy," he said gently. "But we're going to figure it out. Your mom was really brave, and she's still fighting. We're going to make sure she gets the help she needs." Trevor nodded slowly, though his heart felt heavy with unanswered questions. As Riley and Colton continued their investigation, Trevor wandered into his mother's bedroom. The bed was still unmade, and the room felt frozen in time, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for her to return. On the nightstand, Trevor noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small, leather-bound journal. He picked it up, his fingers running over the worn cover. Opening it carefully, he began to read the entries, his mother's neat handwriting filling the pages. The Journal of Jasmine Wilso. The entries were a mix of daily musings and deeper reflections. Trevor read about her struggles to make ends meet, her love for him, and her fears for the future. But as he flipped through the pages, the tone of the journal shifted. There were mentions of a case. The case that changed everything. As Jasmine had written. She described how she had taken on a powerful corporation, exposing their corruption and illegal activities. But the victory came at a cost. Jasmine wrote about the threats she received, the pressure to drop the case, and the isolation that followed. She had been blacklisted from the legal community, left with no job, no support, and a child to care for. Tears blurred Trevor's vision as he read the final entry. I did what I thought was right, but the price was too high. I just hope Trevor knows how much I love him. He's my reason for everything. Trevor clutched the journal to his chest, his heart breaking. His mother had sacrificed everything for what she believed in, and now she was paying the ultimate price. He didn't fully understand the complexities of her decisions, but he knew one thing for certain. She had been brave. And now it was his turn to be brave for her. Shadows in the past. Trevor clutched his mother's journal tightly as if it were a lifeline. The worn leather edges pressed firmly against his small chest. The words he had read echoed in his mind. Descriptions of fear, defiance, and the sacrifices his mother had made. Jasmine had always been his superhero, but now he understood that her strength had come with a cost. It was a cost he hadn't known she was paying, and the weight of it felt too heavy for his young heart. Detective Colton appeared in the doorway of Jasmine's bedroom, her sharp eyes softening when she saw Trevor with the journal. She crouched down beside him, her voice gentle. "What's that, Trevor?" Trevor hesitated, clutching the journal tighter. "It's my mom's. I think she wrote about why she stopped being a lawyer." His voice trembled, and he looked up at Colton with a mix of fear and determination. People were mean to her. They made her stop. Colton's heart broke at the raw emotion in Trevor's voice. She extended a hand toward the journal. "Can I take a look, Trevor? It might help us figure out what happened to your mom." Trevor stared at her hand for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. He handed the journal to Colton, his small fingers lingering on the edge as if letting it go was giving up a piece of his mother. Colton opened the journal carefully, flipping through the pages with the respect it deserved. The more she read, the deeper her frown became. "It's worse than I thought," Colton murmured under her breath, her eyes scanning Jasmine's detailed account of her final case as a lawyer. "What do you mean?" Trevor asked, his voice small but steady. Colton looked at him, choosing her words carefully. "Your mom was really brave, Trevor. She stood up to some very powerful people because she wanted to help others. But those people didn't like that, and they tried to hurt her because of it." Trevor's brow furrowed in confusion. "Why would they do that? She didn't do anything wrong." Colton sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Sometimes, when people in power feel threatened, they do bad things to protect themselves. Your mom was fighting for what was right, but they made her life very hard because of it." Trevor nodded slowly, his young mind struggling to fully grasp the complexity of what Colton was saying. But one thing was clear. His mom had been a fighter, and she had stood up against people who tried to scare her into silence. The corporation that started it all. As Colton delved deeper into Jasmine's journal and the documents she had found in the house, a name kept appearing. Calder Global Industries. It was a name Colton recognized immediately. Calder Global was a massive corporation with its fingers in everything from manufacturing to pharmaceuticals. Over the years, they had faced accusations of corruption, environmental violations, and labor abuses, but nothing had ever stuck. Their legal team was known for its ruthless efficiency in silencing dissent, and their influence stretched far and wide. Colton flipped through Jasmine's meticulous notes, piecing together the story of her final case. Jasmine had represented a group of whistleblowers who had come forward with evidence of Calder Global's illegal dumping of toxic waste. The case had been explosive, threatening to expose the company's dangerous practices and hold them accountable. Jasmine had won the case, securing a landmark victory for her clients, but the aftermath had been devastating. The threats began almost immediately. Anonymous letters filled with veiled warnings appeared in her mailbox. Her car was vandalized. Late-night phone calls interrupted her sleep, the voice on the other end warning her to drop the crusade or else. And then came the professional repercussions. Jasmine's law firm, under pressure from Calder Global's legal team, had terminated her contract. Word spread quickly, and soon, no firm in the city would hire her. Jasmine's once promising career was over, and she was left to pick up the pieces while caring for Trevor on her own. The mystery deepens. Riley, Colton called from the living room, where she had spread out Jasmine's documents and evidence. The officer entered the room, his expression serious. "I think we're dealing with something much bigger than we realized." Riley frowned, crossing his arms. "What do you mean?" Colton held up one of the letters she had found in the box. "This is from a former Calder Global employee, someone who was part of the whistleblower case. They mentioned strange illnesses affecting people who lived near the dumping sites, but more importantly, they say they were being followed after testifying in court." Riley's eyes narrowed. "You think this has something to do with what happened to Jasmine?" Colton nodded. "I'd bet on it. Calder Global has a history of going after people who threaten their bottom line. Jasmine was the face of that case. They couldn't stop her in court, so they ruined her life afterward." Riley glanced toward the bedroom, where Trevor sat quietly on the edge of the bed. His heart ached for the boy, caught in the web of something far beyond his understanding. "So what's the next step?" "We need to dig deeper," Colton said firmly. "I'm going to reach out to some contacts who've dealt with Calder Global before. If they're involved, we need to bring this to light. And we need to figure out if Jasmine's collapse has anything to do with them." Riley nodded. "Let's make sure we're careful. If Calder Global's as ruthless as you say, they won't hesitate to come after anyone who gets in their way." A mother's legacy. While the adults strategized, Trevor remained in his mother's room, staring at the items she had left behind. The journal had revealed so much about her life, things he had never known. But there was one entry that stuck with him more than any other. "I don't regret standing up for what's right. If I don't, who will? But sometimes I wonder if I've done enough to protect Trevor. He's my world, and I would give anything to keep him safe." Trevor wiped at his eyes, fresh tears falling as he whispered to himself, "I'll be strong, Mom, just like you." In that moment, Trevor made a silent vow. No matter what happened, he would honor his mother's bravery. She had fought for what was right, even when it cost her everything. And now it was his turn to stand tall, to face the challenges ahead with the same courage she had shown. As he sat there, a quiet determination began to grow within him. He didn't know how or when, but he was going to make sure that his mom's sacrifices weren't in vain. Whatever secrets Calder Global was hiding, they wouldn't stay buried forever. Shadows in the past. Trevor sat on the edge of his mother's bed, the fading afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the room. The journal lay open on his lap, its pages filled with his mother's neat handwriting, revealing secrets he hadn't imagined. As much as the revelations frightened him, they also made him feel closer to his mom, like he was uncovering a part of her she had hidden away to protect him. Trevor traced his fingers over the words, pausing at one particular entry. "I don't regret standing up for the people who needed me, but the price is high. The threats come every day now, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Trevor deserves a safe, happy life, and I can't let them take that away from him." He wiped his tears, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and determination. His mom had fought so hard, and now it felt like her battle was unfinished. Trevor didn't know how he could help, but he was desperate to find a way. Detective Colton's new lead. In the living room, Detective Colton shuffled through the documents she had spread across the coffee table. The more she read, the clearer the picture became. Calder Global Industries wasn't just ruthless, it was insidious. The evidence Jasmine had gathered during her case was damning. Internal memos exposing deliberate cover-ups of illegal dumping, falsified safety reports, and even evidence of bribery within local regulatory agencies. One letter stood out from the rest. It wasn't from Jasmine's legal files, but appeared to be personal. The handwriting was shaky, and the words were scrawled hurriedly. "Jasmine, I can't stay silent anymore. They're watching me, and I'm scared. But the people in that community, our community, deserve better. If anything happens to me, keep fighting. You're the only one who can." The letter was unsigned, but postmarked from a nearby town. Colton's stomach churned. Whoever had written this had been terrified, and their fear had likely been justified. She wondered if they were still alive, or if Calder Global had silenced them for good. As she filed the letter with the rest of the evidence, Colton's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw the name of one of her trusted contacts, Sam Vargas, an investigative journalist who had spent years exposing corporate corruption. She answered quickly. "Sam, I need your help," Colton said, diving straight to the point. "I'm working on a case tied to Calder Global. Have you heard anything recently about their activities?" Sam's voice was grim. "Colton, you're stepping into dangerous territory. Calder Global is one of the most litigious corporations out there. They've got a team of lawyers who specialize in burying people like you and me." "I know," Colton replied, her tone sharp. "But I think they've gone beyond legal threats. I'm looking at evidence that suggests they've been targeting whistleblowers. And now, maybe even my victim, Jasmine Wilso." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Sam spoke again. "Jasmine Wilso. That name rings a bell. She was the attorney who took them to court over the toxic dumping case, right?" "That's her," Colton confirmed. "She's in critical condition now, and I think Calder Global might have something to do with it. But I need more to go on." Sam let out a low whistle. "I'll dig into my archives and see what I can find. But Colton, be careful. If Calder Global is involved, you're not just dealing with a corporate giant. You're dealing with people who don't play by the rules." "Thanks, Sam," Colton said, hanging up the phone. Her resolve hardened. She wasn't about to let this case go cold, not when it involved the life of an innocent woman and her son. Trevor finds courage. As the evening wore on, Trevor wandered into the living room. Drawn by the quiet determination on Colton's face, she looked up as he approached, giving him a small smile. "Hi, Trevor," she said gently. "How are you holding up?" Trevor shrugged, his small shoulders slumping. "I don't know. I don't want anything bad to happen to my mom." Colton's expression softened. She crouched down to his level, meeting his eyes. "Trevor, I promise you, we're doing everything we can to help her. Your mom is an incredible woman. She's so strong, and she's fought hard for what she believes in. That kind of strength doesn't just go away." Trevor nodded, though his eyes were still clouded with worry. "She always told me to be brave. She said if you believe in something, you have to stand up for it, no matter how hard it is." Colton smiled. "She's right. And you know what? You're already being brave. Just by being here and talking about her, you're helping more than you know." Trevor's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, and he stood a little taller. "I just want to help her. She's my mom." Colton placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're helping her just by being you, Trevor. And if there's anything else you want to tell me about your mom, anything that might help us figure this out, I'm here to listen." Trevor hesitated, then said, "Sometimes she got weird phone calls. She'd go into her room and talk really quietly. And when she came out, she looked scared. I didn't know why. I thought it was just work stuff." Colton's brow furrowed. "Do you remember anything else about the calls? Did she ever mention who it was?" Trevor shook his head. "No, but one time she said, 'I'm not scared of you,' and hung up the phone really fast." Colton's heart sank. The threats Jasmine had faced hadn't stopped after her court victory. If anything, they had escalated. And now, those threats might have caught up to her. A glimmer of hope. As the night deepened, Colton, Riley, and Trevor worked together to piece together the fragments of Jasmine's life. They examined her notes, her journal, and the evidence she had fought so hard to preserve. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Jasmine had been targeted not just for her work, but for her refusal to back down. Trevor's eyes grew heavy, and Riley gently guided him to the couch, draping a blanket over him. "Get some rest, buddy," Riley said softly. "We'll keep working. Your mom would want you to take care of yourself." Trevor nodded sleepily, his hand clutching the edge of the blanket. "You'll find out what happened, right? You'll help her." Riley smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll do everything we can, Trevor. I promise." As Trevor drifted off to sleep, Colton leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Calder Global might have tried to silence Jasmine, but they hadn't accounted for the people who cared about her. They hadn't accounted for a tenacious detective, a determined officer, and a little boy whose love for his mom was stronger than fear. "Riley," Colton said, her voice low but firm. "We're getting close. Calder Global doesn't get to win this time." Riley nodded, his jaw set. "Let's make sure they don't." The storm unleashed. The house was eerily quiet as the clock ticked past midnight. Trevor was curled up on the couch under a blanket, his small frame rising and falling with each exhausted breath. Detective Colton and Officer Riley sat at the dining table, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the desk lamp as they combed through Jasmine's files. "I've never seen anything like this," Riley muttered, shaking his head as he scanned a letter from one of Calder Global's former employees. They weren't just threatening her. These people were trying to erase her. Colton nodded, her eyes narrowing as she picked up a document showing falsified safety reports from one of Calder Global's chemical plants. They'd buried people before, journalists, activists, even lawyers. But Jasmine didn't stay buried. She took them to court and won, and that made her a target. Riley rubbed the back of his neck, the weight of the case pressing down on him. If they've been after her for this long, do you think her collapse was an accident? Or was it them? Colton's jaw tightened. "We don't know yet, but I wouldn't put anything past Calder Global. Their track record speaks for itself. And if Jasmine was still holding on to evidence that could hurt them, they might have decided to make her disappear permanently." She flipped through another set of papers, pausing at a document labeled confidential. It was a copy of an internal Calder Global memo, dated years ago, but still damning. The memo outlined a strategy for discrediting whistleblowers and silencing legal opposition through any means necessary, legal, financial, or otherwise. "This," Colton said, sliding the memo toward Riley. "This is how they operate. They destroy people's lives from the inside out." Jasmine wasn't just fighting them in court. She was fighting them in every part of her life. Riley leaned forward, his eyes scanning the document. If this is how they handled their opponents, it's no wonder Jasmine's life fell apart. But how did she get her hands on this? Someone on the inside must have helped her. Colton nodded. "That's my guess. One of the whistleblowers, or maybe even a disgruntled employee. But whoever it was, they're either very brave or very dead." The weight of her words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the stakes. Calder Global wasn't just a corporation. It was a machine, one that crushed anyone who stood in its way. A late-night revelation. As the hours crept toward dawn, Colton and Riley were jolted from their thoughts by a soft sound from the living room. Trevor was stirring, his eyes fluttering open as he sat up, clutching the blanket around his shoulders. "Can't sleep, kiddo?" Riley asked, his voice gentle. Trevor shook his head, his eyes wide and haunted. "I keep thinking about Mom. She always told me to be brave. But I don't feel brave right now." Colton walked over, kneeling in front of him. "It's okay to be scared, Trevor. What you're going through is really hard. But your mom would be so proud of you. You've been so strong already." Trevor hesitated, then said, "There's something I remember. Something my mom told me to do if anything bad ever happened." Both Colton and Riley leaned in, their interest piqued. "She said if I ever felt like she was in trouble, I should look under her bed." Trevor said, his voice trembling. "She said there was something important there." Colton and Riley exchanged a look before Colton nodded. "Let's check it out." The three of them made their way back to Jasmine's room, the dim light from the hallway casting long shadows across the walls. Trevor stood by the doorway as Colton crouched beside the bed, reaching underneath. Her hand brushed against something solid, and she pulled out a locked metal box, its surface scratched and worn. "Do you know the code?" Colton asked Trevor. Trevor nodded, stepping forward. "It's my birthday." Colton handed him the box, and Trevor carefully punched in the numbers. With a soft click, the lock released, and the lid swung open. Inside was a treasure trove of evidence. More documents, USB drives, and even a small recorder. "What is all this?" Riley asked, peering over Colton's shoulder. Colton picked up one of the USB drives, holding it up to the light. "This is the kind of evidence that could bring Calder Global to its knees. A dangerous decision." As the sun began to rise, Colton, Riley, and Trevor sat around the dining table, the metal box between them. They had gone through a fraction of the contents, but it was already clear that Jasmine had been holding on to something explosive. "There are recordings of phone calls," Colton said, holding up the small recorder. "Jasmine must have known she was being threatened and decided to document everything." Riley nodded, his expression grim. "This could be enough to reopen the investigation into Calder Global's practices. If we get this into the right hands, it could change everything." Trevor looked between them, his young face filled with determination. "You can use it to help my mom, right? You can make them stop hurting her." Colton placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're going to do everything we can, Trevor. But exposing the company like Calder Global is dangerous. We'll need to be careful." Riley frowned. "We can't do this alone. Calder Global's reach is too wide. We need allies. People who can help us get this evidence out safely." Colton nodded. "I've already contacted a journalist I trust. If anyone can help us blow the lid off this, it's him." Trevor's face lit up with hope, but Colton knew better than to make promises she couldn't keep. Calder Global was a formidable opponent, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. But as she looked at Trevor's hopeful expression, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just fighting for justice, they were fighting for Jasmine, a woman who had given everything to protect her son and stand up for what was right. The calm before the storm. As the morning light streamed through the windows, Trevor finally fell asleep on the couch, exhausted but a little more at peace. Riley and Colton stood nearby, their voices low as they planned their next steps. "We need to get this evidence to the journalist as soon as possible," Colton said. "The longer we wait, the more risk we're taking." Riley nodded. "Agreed. But we also need to keep Trevor safe. If Calder Global finds out we have this, they won't hesitate to come after him." Colton's jaw tightened. "Then we keep this quiet. No one outside our circle knows about this until the story breaks." Riley glanced toward Trevor, his heart heavy. "Let's hope we can protect him long enough to make that happen." As they prepared to leave, Colton picked up Jasmine's journal, slipping it into her bag. It was a reminder of the stakes, of the woman who had fought so hard and sacrificed so much. Jasmine's story wasn't over, not yet. And as long as Colton and Riley had breath in their bodies, they wouldn't let Calder Global win. Outside, the morning air was crisp and cool, the world seemingly oblivious to the storm that was brewing. But for Colton, Riley, and Trevor, the fight was just beginning. With the evidence in hand and the truth on their side, they were ready to take on whatever came next. But deep in the shadows, Calder Global was watching, and they weren't about to let their secrets come to light without a fight. The fight for truth. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as Detective Colton and Officer Riley worked swiftly, determined to keep ahead of whatever Calder Global might throw their way. Trevor remained asleep on the couch, clutching his blanket like a shield against the world. The evidence they had uncovered in the metal box lay spread across the dining table, a collection of USB drives, documents and recordings that painted a damning picture of a corporation willing to do anything to protect its power. Colton flipped through the pages of Jasmine's journal once more, searching for any overlooked detail that could help them. Her notes were meticulous, her words raw and determined. Jasmine had documented every step of her fight against Calder Global, from the initial whistleblower testimonies to the legal threats and the mounting pressure that followed. "She knew this was dangerous," Colton murmured, her voice filled with quiet admiration. "But she didn't back down." Riley nodded, his expression grim. She fought harder than most people ever would. And now it's up to us to make sure her work wasn't in vain. The journalist arrives. By mid-morning, Sam Vargas, the investigative journalist Colton had contacted, arrived at the house. He was a wiry man with sharp eyes and a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His reputation as a fearless reporter preceded him. Sam was known for exposing corruption at the highest levels, regardless of the risks. "This is big," Sam said as Colton briefed him on the situation. He picked up one of the USB drives, turning it over in his hand. "If the evidence on these is as strong as you say, Calder Global is in serious trouble. But you need to understand something. Once this story gets out, there's no going back. They'll come after everyone involved." Colton's jaw tightened. "We know the risks, Sam. But Jasmine didn't go through all of this just to have her work buried. We owe it to her, and to Trevor, to make sure the truth comes out." Sam glanced toward the couch, where Trevor was stirring awake. The boy sat up, rubbing his eyes, and looked around the room with a mix of confusion and determination. He spotted Sam and walked over cautiously. "Who's he?" Trevor asked, his voice still heavy with sleep. "This is Sam," Colton said gently. "He's a journalist. He's going to help us tell your mom's story." Trevor's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. He's going to stop the bad people. Sam crouched down to Trevor's level, his expression serious but kind. "That's the plan, kiddo. Your mom was incredibly brave, and we're going to make sure the world knows what she did." Trevor nodded, his small hands balling into fists. "Good. I don't want them to hurt her anymore." The leak. Sam set up his laptop at the dining table, plugging in the USB drives and opening the files. The room was silent except for the faint clicking of keys as he sifted through the troves of evidence. Each file revealed more about Calder Global's illegal activities. Financial records proving bribery, internal memos discussing the cover-up of environmental violations, and even surveillance reports on Jasmine and other whistleblowers. "This is gold," Sam said, his voice tinged with excitement and urgency. "But it's also dangerous. We need to move fast before they figure out we have this." "What's the plan?" Riley asked, his arms crossed as he stood watch near the window. Sam glanced up from his laptop. "I'll release the initial story through a secure platform, one that Calder Global can't touch. Once it's live, the evidence will be available for other reporters and legal teams to dig into. They won't be able to shut it down without drawing more attention to themselves." Colton nodded. "And what about Jasmine? We need to make sure she's safe. If Calder Global realizes we've exposed them, she could still be a target." Sam frowned. "I'll include her story in the article, but we'll keep her location vague. The goal is to protect her while shining a light on what's been happening."